The following is for information purposes only and should not be considered investment advice. All opinions and views expressed by the contributors to this podcast are in a personal capacity only. They do not represent the views of Progressive Equity Research or any other organisation mentioned in this podcast.
Okay, it is Friday the 6th of March. It's been a while since we spoke, but welcome back, Jeremy. Good to have you here.
Hi, Gareth. Yeah, good to be here.
An awful lot has gone on since we last spoke, but most of it in the last 5 or 6 days. So
Just a bit, yeah.
There's a phenomenal and deeply concerning set of developments going on. It would be great to get your take on what you think are the most important bits of those developments and how markets have been reacting and what it might all mean. Where would we start?
Well, it's a testing time, these markets, because, a week or so ago, I was spending most of my time trying to become an expert on agentic AI and trying to understand how the world is going to make people like us completely redundant. And what do you know, within the space of about 24 hours, you have to become an expert in geopolitics, energy markets, and
geography.
Military operations. Yeah, and geography.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, clearly the events of the last week is the most significant geopolitical, political and economic event since the invasion of Ukraine 4 years ago now.
No, for sure.
Possibly including that, because it really offers a risk and reward scenario that at one end of that tale of outcomes is pretty bloody scary, actually, in terms of where it can take us and how it can accelerate to being a much broader conflict. And without wishing to scare people, there are people out there who have been saying that we've been living in World War III for a while. And that kind of framing has largely been for the clickbait. But, the more I think about the events of the last few days, the more I think one can connect dots to see how that scenario might play out. And I don't wish to upset people's weekend listening by saying that, but I think one has to wrap a cold towel around your head and really try and analyse these things rationally as you can.
I think, yes. The Ukraine situation, it certainly feels more contained to the local region. It wasn't going to spread west into Europe that much for obvious sort of NATO-backed reasons. The best or the worst outcomes really were and are confined to the fortunes of the Ukrainian people.
Yeah.
And yes, there are modest implications in terms of various markets and oil and food and all those sorts of things. But the Iran situation, as you've seen from the market reaction, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute, is much more global, much more quickly. And I think the spread of possible or even likely outcomes is a lot wider. It could turn into a more dramatic regionalized conflict.
Yeah. This has moved on from just being a conflict with Iran. This is a regional conflict already. There are half a dozen or more countries in that region who have been at least on the receiving end of projectiles from Iran. People are being drawn into this conflict. Some of us are trying to dance around it and stay out of it, but more and more countries are being drawn into this. So it is definitely becoming a wider regional conflict, but it happens to centre on a part of the world which hasn't gone unnoticed in oil markets that is crucial for the export of not just crude oil, but crucially for Europe and Asian markets for the world's consumption of gas, LNG, which Qatar is a major supplier, and the vast majority of that gas is now trapped behind the Straits of Hormuz. And that's reflecting itself in energy markets. And while the prices have been volatile, they've broadly been going up this week. And I think as we speak, I've just checked, Brent crude is now at $87 a barrel, which in the grand scheme of things is not in absolute danger alert zone. But I think the initial response in energy markets when this conflict broke out was sort of the recency bias type shock that whether it was the decapitation of Venezuela earlier this year or the bombing of Iran last year, that this would be one short, sharp shock, which it could be. But I think these markets are now beginning to reflect that this could endure, and the implications for the global economy, the geopolitics of the world, and domestic politics of various countries, including our own, have yet to really be properly considered here. And I think there are longer term implications in all of those areas. The other dimension with Iran is that there's this assumption that the planners in the Pentagon and in Israel, or certainly the ones in the Pentagon, they run the risk that they're assessing the people who are calling the shots in Iran. And bear in mind that within the early stages of this conflict, most of the entire leadership of Iran has been taken out. But Iran is still sending a large quantity of projectiles, missiles and drones into its neighboring countries. And at the moment, there's no discernible slowdown in that rate of response.
Okay.
And I guess, open question, was this an opportunistic strike because they knew they could take the head off the animal? The animal is clearly still living, but we don't know what its reaction function is. Has it ever been, in the last 45 years of Iran's existence, a rational economic actor in the way that Ukraine is to the invasion of Russia? You know, different nations have different response functions.
Yes.
But if you believe the answer's somewhere else than on planet Earth, you're not going to behave in the same way as if you think you've got to protect the welfare of your citizens at some stage.
Agreed. It does feel like they're playing by different rules, and that adds a degree of unpredictability to the situation.
Yes.
So we've talked a bit about the oil price reaction. How are markets more broadly reacting? And I think it'd be good to understand your view on fears around inflation coming through, what that's doing to treasury yields or central bank expectations.
Well, of course, we started the year with the world enjoying somewhat of an oil glut. The oil price had remained weak for a while and was, if anything, likely to fall.
Drill, baby, drill was coming true. Yeah.
Yeah. And that Venezuela would follow the drill, baby, drill mantra. It might take a while, but it was going to be revitalized. That the US shale patch was continuing to perform at least in line with expectations, and other places in South America are getting more production on stream. That whole scenario has been turned on its head.
Yeah.
Of course, this assessment comes back to how long is this conflict going to go on for? Have the US bitten off more than they can chew? And to come back to the Ukrainian analogy, a week into when Russia first went into Ukraine, I think most people were saying, well, probably by the end of the month, the Russians would be in Kiev and it'll be game over. 4 years later, that hasn't happened. So I think the market's ability, or the media's ability, to assess how long this might take is not particularly good. So if it goes on for more than a few weeks, let's say 6, this has major implications for inflation and economic growth. And the sort of outlier high performers in the global equity market have reacted sharply. I mean, while mainstream developed European and North American markets have proven to be quite resilient, things like mining stocks, principal component costs are energy, have started to significantly underperform the price action of the resources. So gold miners, where people are sitting on good returns in the last year or so, have been marked down.
Yeah.
The biggest single country to be affected by this has been South Korea, where market's down something like 20% so far this week. Now, a place like Korea, you can see why it's in the frame, because it imports 95% of its energy from the Middle East. It has no sources of hydrocarbons itself. So it's got no self-reliant energy security. And it's got a thing called North Korea, which is nuclear armed, sitting on top of it, which is one of the reasons why Korean equities have historically been quite cheap.
So definitely the regional alarm bells are ringing. There's risk that some of those other actors will see an opportunity or take a chance to do things they otherwise would be wary of doing.
Yeah. 2 headlines I noticed today. I think Hesketh responsible for both of them. He was saying that the US was dominating Iranian airspace and that the US had plenty of munitions to keep the war going for as long as required. Now, both of those statements, I would suggest, are observably false.
Right.
If the US had dominance of Iranian airspace, then we would see traffic going through the Straits of Hormuz at the moment, and they're not. And I appreciate there are things called insurance costs and day rates for tankers, which have gone through the roof, of course. But if they were confident of a statement like that, then the first thing the US Navy would be doing would be escorting tankers through the Straits of Hormuz, and they're not doing that.
Well, they've said they will, or they could, but you're right, they haven't yet done it. No,
Okay,
absolutely.
so let's see.
Right.
And the other one is they haven't got endless supplies of munitions. And to the extent that they might get endless supplies of munitions, they rely on supply chains, which also rely on the cooperation of China. And we haven't really heard much from China so far.
No, we haven't.
And that's the elephant in the room.
Absolutely. And to keep providing weaponry, either defensive or offensive, for the Middle East, the Americans will be diverting scarce resources and supply chain components, either from what's going on in Ukraine or from protecting locations and assets out in the Far East. So this has to come at the expense of something else. So I understand you'll be looking at something called Kharg Island. I think it'd be worth just quickly letting people know what Kharg Island is and why it might suddenly become a bit more famous than it has been.
Well, yeah, there is an island called Kharg Island off the coast of Iran, and the vast majority of Iranian oil exports go through Kharg Island.
And just to be clear, it's an Iranian island.
It's an Iranian island,
Yeah.
about the size of the Isle of Wight, from what I can tell. And it is to the oil industry, or certainly to Gulf oil, what I would say Taiwan is to semiconductors. It is the choke point. And it's coming back to this sort of reaction function, I suppose, is that Kharg Island is the jewel in the crown of the Iranian economy. It is the central point of failure, the central point of success. It is the choke point, and it is definitely what the Americans need to gain control of. And it is being pointed out, if what is left of the Iranian regime decide that they can no longer carry on, they cannot take out Israel, which is their stated ambition, but assuming they can't get that far, one thing they can do is to take the approach that if we're not having Kharg Island, you're not either, and taking it out. And I think in that scenario, you're talking about a long-term disruption to supply of oil, particularly to Asia, from the Middle East, that would almost certainly see oil substantially higher than it is today.
Right.
These are potential outcomes. These are scenarios. This is not destined to happen.
Well, we'll keep an eye on it and see what happens. And clearly it's a prize asset. Then clearly everybody will be focusing on what happens there and whether the Americans decide to do something or whether the Iranians decide that they want nobody else to have it if they can't.
Yeah, and we're not that far away. I think sometime early next month, Trump is due to meet President Xi. So as we go through this whole episode in the Middle East, I think it's becoming clearer that what, among other things, one of the objectives the Americans have here is to apply more leverage when they come to have these discussions with China in the coming months. They will want to be able to show some form of progress here ahead of having that meeting with Xi, I think first week of April, but I have to double check.
Okay. That's been a super wide-ranging conversation. Is there anything else that you think we should touch on?
I think this is going to dominate the headlines, dominate markets. I think it's getting clarity on the duration of this conflict and what it might take to finally bring a resolution to the problems in the Middle East. And I think Iran has largely been the source of most of the conflicts that we've seen in the Middle East over the last decade or two. It's far from clear at the moment whether this can be resolved in a matter of weeks. And if it takes more than a few months, then I think that has these knock-on ramifications, which frankly are quite scary.
Absolutely. But to try and find a degree of positivity out of it, if there can be a proper regime change, however it's executed, then it would free up even more low-cost oil for the rest of the world. But more importantly, it would also provide a much more stable and hopefully peaceful outlook for a huge part of the Middle East and actually more globally as well. So there are significant gains to be had if it can be delivered.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Great speaking to you, Jeremy. Good to catch up, and we'll talk again soon.
All right.
Talk to you then.
Bye for now.
Cheerio.
Brought to you by Progressive Equity.